Good evening. Overcoming conflict. One of the most important realities about the Bible is that it is the infallible Word of God. And something that really helps to prove this point is the reality that the Bible does not shield us. It doesn't hide from us the failures, the flaws within God's chosen people. It doesn't try to cover up. If I was going to write a history, if I was going to tell you God's story for His chosen people, there's a lot of things I would exclude from the Bible. I wouldn't talk about David's sins with Bathsheba. I would neglect to mention Judas and his failings. We would make it perfect, wouldn't we? If we're going to tell the history, we leave out all that bad stuff, but God chooses to include it. He shows us He's the victor. God is the victor. And they say the victor writes the history books, but the reality is God, He includes everything. He shows us both the good and the bad. Another very important aspect of the Bible, right alongside that, is the reality that through the bad, through the tragic, through the hardships, God shows us that we can overcome. That we are able to lift ourselves up and to continue forward with Him. Now, we are studying the life of Joseph. It's going to take more than one lesson. We should be finished with the book of Genesis in probably about two more lessons after this one. We're right near the end of it. But this evening, we're going to look at his life. We're going to go all the way up to the point in which he is out of prison. He has been in prison. He's going to suffer. And then we're going to see that he is going to be released due to the life he lives. But Joseph has a very difficult life. And he overcomes so much. He overcomes so much conflict. The very first thing that we see him overcoming is jealousy. Overcoming jealousy. There is one thing that is made abundantly clear when you open up the Word of God, when you start studying the life of Joseph, and that is that he is the favored son. That his father Israel absolutely loves him, much like I'm the favored son of my family. No, you see, we understand if you go to Genesis chapter 37, you look at verse 3 and 4, we're told, now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. A lot of jealousy there. To the point that the Bible tells us that his brothers hated him. Now, this is going to cause a lot of resentment, a lot of back and forth, and the brothers do not help matters. In verse 2, we read, and Joseph was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. So they did a lot of stuff they shouldn't be doing. They did a lot of things that were not beneficial to them. And Joseph, he goes and he reports that to his father. So there's going to be problems there. But a lot of the resentment, the jealousy that takes place is partly Joseph's fault. You see, Joseph had been blessed by God to dream dreams, to have visions, and he shares these, and he shares them in such a way that it angers his brothers even more. In fact, at one point, he even upsets his father. In Genesis 37, verse 5, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. In verse 8, and his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. In verses 9 through 10, then he dreamed still another dream, and he told it to his brothers. You'd think after the first dream, he'd have learned his lesson and kept his mouth shut. But he dreams another one. He tells them that dream too. He says, look, I've dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bow down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? Verse 11 tells us his father remembered it. His father kept it in mind. He rebukes him for it. He tells him to mind himself, but he kept it in his mind. But his brothers envied him all the more. There's a lot of jealousy that is stacking up against Joseph. And because of that, we see that when the opportunity arises, Joseph is sent out by his father to go tend to the sheep, to talk to his brothers, to go and to help them. And as they see Joseph coming, we see in verse 18 that they said, "Look, this dreamer is coming." We keep reading, "Come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams." They are so angry. They're so jealous. They're so enraged by the favoritism and by the dreams and by his attitude towards them that they say, "We're just going to kill him. We're going to get rid of the body. We're going to say that wild beasts took him." Now his older brother Reuben has a different idea. Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood," verse 22, "but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father." So he wants to save him. He wants to make sure that he's okay. He doesn't want to allow anything to happen. He's not quite as far off as the other brothers. But his plans, despite the good intention, it doesn't quite go the way he planned. In verse 26, "So Judah said to his brothers, 'What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh.'" You know, some people think that Judah's part in this is why he ends up moving off in chapter 38. Remember, we studied that last week. We looked at Judah and Tamar and the example of the death of his children. Some will believe that this instance, this scenario, is what causes him to leave his father's house and to move away. But Judah, he says, "Hey, let's make some money. Let's not kill him. Let's make some money." And continue on, he says, "And his brothers listened. Then the Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt." Favored son. We see that he has gone from that to now a slave. Taken, sold, almost killed. All because of jealousy. All because of the envy of his brethren. Suddenly the favored son is not so well favored. Then we see that he has to overcome temptation. As we continue our study, we see that he has been really, well, God takes care of him. He gets to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, this is a well-prominent man. An Egyptian bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. Can you imagine the Bible recording that of you? You are a slave, you are in a foreign country, and yet the Bible says you are a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. God was with Joseph to the point that even in his slavery, even despite the fact that he has been sold into slavery, the jealousy of his brothers has been defeated, and he is now a successful man. God's taking care of him. We see that he's given a lot of respect. And verse 4, "So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority." Yes, he's a slave. Yes, this is a bad situation. There's no sugarcoating that. But he is now in charge of the entire household of Pharaoh, a man who is prominent, a man who is a position of authority, a man who's all likelihood has a very lavish lifestyle, and Joseph's in charge of all that. Joseph is helping that lifestyle succeed even more. He's reaping the fruits of that lifestyle. You know he is. You can see it. Verse 6 says, "Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate." Let me give this little tidbit of information. Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So we need to remember that this is a lesson on overcoming conflict. And yes, he's overcome the jealousy of his brothers. He's in a position of authority even. He might be a slave, but he's still in a position of authority. He oversees the entire house. If you're going to be a slave, this is the way you want to do it. He is being well taken care of by God. Provided for exactly with what he needs. But now we're going to see that he has to overcome temptation. In verse 7, "It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes at Joseph. And she said, 'Lie with me.'" I want you to consider some things. He is still a slave. You know, we talk about sexual harassment in the job and the workplace, and one of the big key things is that a supervisor cannot make advances to someone under them because they feel that they do not have the opportunity, they do not have the means to say no. They're put in a situation, a position of it automatically being a problem. How do you think Joseph, a slave, Joseph, an individual who is completely at the whims of his master, feels when his master's wife starts basically throwing herself at him? Now let's take it one step further. Remember that he is 17 when we're first introduced to him as going out to his father. It's probably been a few years. We don't know the exact time frame, but the reality is Joseph is at the very latest. Joseph is in his early 20s at this point. And he has a woman throwing herself at him, demanding things from him. You know, interesting side note and something to consider. The book of Genesis covers sexual assault in chapters 34 and 38. And it covers sexual sins in chapters 37 and 38. It covers the sexual assault of a female and then a male, because this is sexual assault. What she is doing to Joseph, what she is going to do. She physically assaults him in a minute. And it also covers the sexual assault of Dinah, Jacob's daughter, Joseph's sister. It covers that as well. We've talked about the fact that this is the book of beginnings. And I think it's interesting to point out that the Bible is giving us all these problems, all of these hardships that we face, and how he's going to take these issues and turn them into the laws of Moses that we see coming up. He deals with these issues. God takes them. He shows us the problems. He shows us the conflicts, and then he shows us his solution down the way. But the master of the house, the wife of the master that Joseph has come to respect, who's put Joseph in such a wonderful position, is now propositioning him to the point that he feels he's in trouble. What do you think Joseph is going to do? It's temptation. It'd be so easy just to give in. Verse 8 tells us, "But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I.'" I told you that Joseph was put into a position of authority, a position of power, that he was, he has it really good. He says, there's no one in this house greater than me. He is a slave, and he is confident saying that to his master's wife. Nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? There is a beautiful lesson we can talk about right there. When God has blessed us over and over and over, how can we do this great wickedness and sin against God? Look at what God had done for Joseph, a slave. And yet he still says, I have been blessed with such greatness. So it was as she spoke to Joseph, day by day. This is not a one-time thing. This is every single day. That he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. Verse 12, then she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. I told you this was sexual assault. This is it. When she realizes that she can't get him by persuasion, she literally grabs a hold of him. She's attempting to force him. Catches hold of him to the point that she's got a hold of his garment, and his only option is to flee. And he flees. She yanks his garment off of him, his outer garment. Now we need to understand their clothing. He would have still had an entire undergarment. It's not like he's running outside naked, but for the intents and purposes of what they would have considered, he was naked. That's how they describe it. He would have been clothed, but his outer garment is no longer on him. When she finds out that there is no solution, there's no way to get out of this, there's no way to convince him, she's angry. And jealousy comes back into play. Envy, anger, hatred. So verse 14, remember, she has his garment. How is she going to explain that? She calls the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought in a Hebrew to mock us. She's been mocked in her own mind. He came to me to lie with me, and I cried out in a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment until his master came home. She says, look, he tried to rape me. She levels a false accusation against him. When they tell you there is nothing new under the sun, look at this. We live in a time of false accusations. We live in a time of sexual immorality. Joseph dealt with this. Joseph endured this. It's nothing new. And we see how he overcame it. Now, naturally, as anyone would be, when the master of the house hears, when Potiphar learns, he is angered. He took him, verse 20, he put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. This is the extent of Potiphar's authority. He is capable of using the prison for the king. These would have been political prisoners. These would have been people who, as we see later on, are waiting execution. This isn't a pretty place. It's the king's personal prison. But Joseph overcame temptation. It might not have worked out for him. It might not have been the best result for him. But he did not fail. He overcame temptation. He overcame a position of being in, well, he's between a rock and a hard place. And yet he still managed to come out on top as far as God's concerned. Final conflict that we see Joseph having to overcome is disappointment. You see, verse 20 of chapter 39 tells us that he was taken, he was put in prison. We looked at that a minute ago. He is now in the king's prison. But as we go through, and imagine the trajectory of his life. He is favored son. He is prisoner. He's slave. And now here he is as a prisoner. That's a sharp fall, isn't it? That nothing here is good. But he gets there. And God immediately starts working with him. As you start reading through Genesis chapter 40, you see that the chief guard of the prison sees that Joseph is one who's with God, that God is with him, that God has favored him, that God is taking care of him, and he's put in charge of the prisoners. He's put right back in a position of authority, right back into a position of trust. We see that when there comes an opportunity to use that trust, to use what God has so richly blessed him with, that Joseph doesn't hold back. In verse 5 of chapter 40, then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them. Each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. They have a dream, and we're not going to discuss these dreams. We don't have time to really dig into what goes on, but basically the gist of it is that one is told, guess what? Pharaoh is going to restore you. Everything's going to be okay. The other one is told, this is it. Pharaoh is angry with you. You are going to be put to death. And we see that Joseph doesn't try to hide this harsh truth from people. He doesn't try to do anything. In fact, all Joseph does, the only consideration he has. Now remember, he's falsely imprisoned. He has no reason to be in jail. He didn't do anything. The only request he makes, in verse 14, but remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. He asks for kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. But this is a conflict of disappointment. In verse 23, yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. He forgot him not for a day, not for a week, not for a year. 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream. In Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh has a dream. He is troubled by this dream. And suddenly, the butler remembers. He goes, oh, I have messed up. I was supposed to tell you about Joseph. There is a man who revealed to me the dream, revealed to me my fate while I was in prison, revealed to me what you were going to do for me. And you want to know how we know that Joseph overcame every single conflict that he had? You want to know how we understand? We can see that Joseph never gave in to despair, never allowed the hardships that he faced to beat him down, to make him to cry out in defeat and bitterness. Because after 2 years of being in prison, after suffering the injustice of slavery, the injustice of being falsely accused, the injustice of being attacked sexually, after all of he suffered, as he has been in prison for 2 more years, he says the exact same thing that he said to the butler and the baker all those years ago. It is not in me, verse 16. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. You see, when the baker and the butler came to him, he goes, dreams are not of me, they are of God. God will give the answer. And now, all those years later, 2 more years of imprisonment, years of enslavement, all of this time in which he has endured, Joseph still hasn't given up. He still has faith and trust in God. He still holds on to what God has taught him. He goes, God will reveal the answer. God is with Joseph because Joseph holds true to God. That's why in Genesis 39 verse 2 we're told the Lord was with Joseph. That's why in verse 9 we see Joseph saying, how can I sin against God? That's why in verse 23 the keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him. The key reality in every aspect of Joseph's life, all through this, is that he was with God and God was with him. They were together. And when we are with God and we know that God is with us, it doesn't matter what we're suffering. It doesn't matter what we're enduring. It doesn't matter what's thrown our way. We can overcome the conflict. Now, the result might not be a lot to our liking. Joseph overcame the temptation, but the reaction, the victory over temptation was imprisonment. That's not good for Joseph. But he overcame the conflict. He overcame the problem that he had dealt with. He did not fail. And that is a victory. We need to realize sometimes victory in the Lord is not a victory in the terms or the standard of the world. We might not get that promotion at work. We might not get whatever new thing we want. But if we have maintained our soul, we are victorious. Joseph was with God, and God was with him, and that is a victory. That is overcoming all this conflict. Next week, we're going to see the dream that Joseph reveals for Pharaoh. We're going to see the work that he does for Pharaoh. We're going to see how God takes a slave, a prisoner, and he turns him into the most powerful man in the mightiest nation at that time. You see, being second only to Potiphar is a preamble to what's to come for Joseph. God was preparing him for the power and the authority he would have in the days to come. And Joseph shows himself worthy of this by his willingness to overcome all the hardships that come his way. This evening, we will have hardships, we will suffer, we will face things, and we might not like the results. But if we endure, if we live our life for God, if we make sure that we never give in, we will have victory. Joseph will be second only to Pharaoh, but if we overcome, if we endure, well, as the book of Revelation tells us, be thou faithful unto death, and thou shalt receive a crown of life. This evening, if you are here, and you've been beaten down, you have suffered, you've realized that maybe you just don't think you can go any further, you can, because God is with you. Keep walking the path. Keep living your life for Him and know that victory belongs to God, and that if we are with God, then victory will be ours as well. But the reality of what we see with the life of Joseph is that he was obedient to the law of God. And if you are not living your life as God would have you to live, if you've not done what is necessary to be with God, to be a child of God, to be a faithful child, then we encourage you to come forward this evening, to let us sit down and study, to show you how Joseph lived his life in obedience, and how that mirrors the reality that we must live our life in obedience to Christ, the Son of God. Christ who died for us, Christ who shed his blood so that we might have life. If you are here this evening and you've not been baptized for the remission of your sins, you've not done what is necessary to say that you have called upon the name of the Lord, as Paul tells us to do, then we encourage you, now's the time. Do not delay. Do not put it off till tomorrow. Now is the time. Please come forward as we stand as we sing.
Careless soul, why will you linger?